the very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is alchemy, the whole state of things, pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins, as always sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce today's guest, we just want to mention briefly we do have a Patreon account at patreon.com/MUHH. Consider tossing us $1 a month there, or maybe leave us a nice review on iTunes. Either way, we appreciate you guys for listening to the show. Today, Taylor and I are happy to welcome Jeffrey Bell. Jeffrey is professor of philosophy at Southeastern Louisiana University. His works include Deleuze and Guattari's What is Philosophy? A Critical Introduction and Guide, Deleuze's Hume, Philosophy at the Edge of Chaos, and most recently, an inquiry into Analytic-Continental Metaphysics and its companion volume, Towards a Critical Existentialism. So a very machinic welcome to Jeffrey Bell this morning. Looking forward to shifting gears a little bit, and hopefully you can kind of bridge this gap for us between continental and analytic, but I know you mentioned you do consider yourself more on the Deleuze side of things to some degree.
That's correct.
Put the cards out on the table, right? I'm sure everyone is very surprised.
I'm probably considered a heathen from both sides.
Right, there you go.
Well, hey, that's the best way to be, right? That's the there's a Deleuze bot on Twitter who would just post a lot of quotes from Deleuze, a lot of times from the seminars, which I find really fascinating because I haven't gotten to delve into all of them. There's a lot there, but I think the quote today that I saw, which I retweeted, was it is said that Spinoza kept his coat with a dagger hole in it to remind himself that men are not always appreciative, or they're not always appreciative, or something like this of thought.
That's funny. I just saw that this morning too.
Okay.
I love that. That was good.
So maybe as a heathen, if we consider Spinoza as excommunicate, heretic, heathen, so to speak, panentheist or pantheist, then you're in good company.
Good.
The last thing I read before this work of yours was in preparation for the episode we did. Gosh, Coop, we probably did it almost a year ago, where it was just Coop and I talking about, we were going through some of the monographs of Deleuze, and we went to empiricism and subjectivity. So I do remember looking at your work on Deleuze's Hume. That was helpful in getting a kind of a nice ground into this first book that he puts out, and a lot of context behind, first of all, why he would have published and some of the history behind it, but also, bringing to the fore why it's important for, his work as a whole. And I think that just reading it in isolation the first time, I was like, man, this seems like there's even a break between the Hume book and the Nietzsche book, right? There's that 10 years. Anyway, I'm not really asking a question, and I know we could talk for a whole episode on that. I do want to give you the chance, though, as always, as I promised you, to say a little bit more about yourself, about your intellectual origin story, about how you may have come to encounter, philosophy and, Deleuze in particular, and leading up to the origins of this book.
In many ways, my recent 2-volume is kind of almost a full circle to the origin story. So it's kind of a appropriate place to begin. My first exposure to philosophy was actually, I think I was in like junior high, and I rode to a local library, and I used to kind of just explore the aisles just to kind of see what was in the different aisles. And I came to the philosophy section. I was like, well, what's this? And so I pulled off Plato. I'd heard of Plato before, so I pulled off the dialogue, and I started reading one of the dialogues. And I thought it was great. I don't think I really understood it. I mean, I was like 9. So it planted a seed that there's something interesting going on with philosophy. And the thing about the dialogues was it was sort of in a kind of literary style, kind of as a sort of narrative. And then my second sort of seed that got planted was in high school. I took a great literature class, and we read Camus and we read Jean-Paul Sartre. The Sartre in particular, we read Nausea. And I was like, man, this is great. So that got me to read a fair bit of Jean-Paul Sartre. And then it kind of fell by the wayside again until I was in college and I took an existentialism class where I then got Nietzsche and Sartre. Then I was hooked. And then from that point on, I kind of stayed with philosophy. My connection, how that got morphed into Deleuze scholarship was primarily through Merleau-Ponty. I always felt that there was too much focus on the conscious experience in phenomenology. And so I began to think that Merleau-Ponty was kind of right when he was talking about the body, and then later on about this concept of flesh. And that led me down that sort of rabbit hole of Merleau-Ponty. But then in the context of doing that, I came across Foucault and his history of madness. And then not long after that, his introduction to Anti-Oedipus, which I started to read and it made no sense.
The intro or the book Anti-Oedipus?
The first part of it. At the time, I was like, what's going on here? And then a couple of years later, I was still doing Merleau-Ponty. My dissertation, which was published as my first book, was primarily on Husserl and Merleau-Ponty with some Deleuze at the end. And it was really 1,000 Plateaus that kind of where the light bulb clicked and went off. And from that point on, I sort of have continued working with Deleuze, but in the same sort of way that 1,000 Plateaus is doing philosophy by doing non-philosophy. My approach to Deleuze has been to kind of do Deleuze by not doing Deleuze, by taking Deleuze to write on Hume, taking Deleuze to write on the analytic tradition in philosophy, taking Deleuze to write on all the other figures that were in the Edge of Chaos, rather than just being strictly about Deleuze. And I think that's sort of the dynamic that his philosophy engaged with itself. And it's sort of something that I've kind of picked up as my own sort of work as well.
I mean, even what is philosophy characterizes that so well. You know, it de-hierarchizes philosophy as having a monopoly on thinking, but it also allows it to share in the process of creation, right? And I think that goes to show, you know, something about doing philosophy. And you think of the last lines of the book where philosophy needs non-philosophy in Deleuze's sense. Let's not bring in Laruelle here, right? But science needs non-science, art needs non-art. So these nons are these essential interlocutors and interferers that also kind of explains, to turn to the present work, this interest in, well, let's say, to anticipate a bit, in something like the mixture, right, of that you isolate from Plato's Philebus, and your focus at the beginning and at the end of the book on this question of the new, its conditions, and sort of what is at stake there. So I see the kind of full circle, and I suppose then, do you think trying to bridge, if I will, I know that it kind of almost is a cliche now, but I do think that we can perhaps call it, and you might have your own terms for it, but this notion of bridging the analytic-continental divide, is this, as you were saying, another way of doing Deleuze is focusing on this supposed division that perhaps is more of a, I don't know, an appearance or a semblance than it is something rooted in reality?
Yeah, I think the way I've sort of approached most of the questions that I'm looking at these days, and the connection with existentialism and kind of telescoping ahead to the second volume, is the questions of meaning or questions of sense. And I've long thought that Deleuze never completely broke with some key themes of the existential tradition. Despite, I had friends in grad school that are, oh, Deleuze is like 180% opposite of what the existential tradition is doing. And in some respects, I think that's probably true, but not when it comes to the question of sense or meaning. And I think that's also one way in which I've looked at this bridging of analytic-continental is that the questions of meaning, especially sort of early on, the early analytic tradition in terms of, I don't know, the Russell's theory of descriptions and all that sort of theory of meaning as X is the author of Waverley, all that kind of stuff. How can things mean and the like? But my sense is that the way they take up questions of meaning, and that's the key point, the questions around meaning are different in the analytic tradition than in, I think, the continental or Deleuze's tradition. I think both questions, what I call truth questions and relevance questions in the book. And I think the analytic tradition tends to be in the vein of science, more akin to a kind of what is it question, as opposed to the kind of where, when, who, how, which context, those kinds of relevance questions. Those are the questions that really bring out the meaning of a situation. And I think those are the questions that motivate Deleuze. And they also motivate the existential tradition too. So I think that's again where I find the sort of coming back full circle with Deleuze and the existential tradition. So as you can see, this book is really trying to set up a lot of the arguments that will come out in that second volume.
And I like that in the intro, because what I was looking in the intro is like, where is he? To get back to what we started with, when are the cards going to be on the table where it's like, look, I'm a Deleuzian, I'm gonna beat you over the head with Deleuze, which you don't do. But obviously, having a little bit of the background that I do, and readers of your work who are familiar with your other works, probably their ears perked up as well during the intro, where you raise this question of the analytic side privileging the what is versus, these questions of truth versus these relevance questions, because as we know in Difference Repetition, Deleuze is kind of castigating philosophy for privileging the what is question, which he maybe unfairly, but he associates culminating with Hegel, but also culminating in what he calls the aporetic dialogues of Plato, where, this what is question predominates, and it's nihilistic because it's really meant to open up to these later dialogues that aren't presupposing the sort of superiority of that question. So I guess that's one of those interesting things that I really liked about the introduction, is how clearly you detail maybe the tendency for analytic philosophy to imitate science or try to become science. And I think that there's something in that tendency, and this is just my bias, that seems to kill off philosophy's uniqueness and its originality, and almost trying to subsume philosophy, lead it to its death, if you will, and practice a kind of, whether it be in strict linguistic analysis or symbolic logic or something like this, trying to metamorphose philosophy into some sort of science, some sort of subdivision of language study or whatnot. Do you think that that's maybe where the tendency leads?
In its extreme form, yes, I think that's exactly right. And Stephen Hawking represents one of the, I don't remember if I cited that passage.
You did. In the intro, you bring up Hawking saying like, look, philosophy's dead, physics has it all solved. You need
And even Kant was bemoaning the fact that the sciences seem to be doing great, but not philosophy. And the assumption is that philosophy needs to be more like science to finally become like the sciences, get the sort of recognition it deserves. And one of my arguments is that no, philosophy has never been a science.
Right.
I mean, it has different concerns that it's working with. And that is sort of one of the main themes that I'm at least beginning with and trying to explore. And as I unpack it, it's these relevance questions, or the questions of problems that become central as the work goes forward. And that's the interesting thing. I've had correspondence with some analytic philosophers, and their characterization of continental philosophy is that continental philosophers are obsessed with figures, whether it's Heidegger, Derrida, Deleuze, you name it. And the analytic philosophers are concerned with problems, right? The problems of, the one and the many in their own way of dealing with it. And ironically, I think what I've done in this book is try to show how what is foundational to Deleuze's own project is an understanding of problems. But it's in a different way than the analytic tradition takes it up.
So by figures, then you think that they would, instead of saying maybe continental philosophy would privilege literature, art, or something like this, and even verge on sort of becoming art or some sort of writing experiment. The claims that you got was more that philosophy is privileging what the great names or something like this.
And exegesis on these star figures in the continental tradition.
That can be fair. I mean, we can obviously that kind of tendency could become. I mean, one can imagine at its lowest form could become a kind of, whether it be a hero worship, which I don't know if that's necessarily true, but the exegesis thing that you bring up could be a problem, because then one starts to treat, these texts of philosophy as though they were holy scripture. And then that's where I think too that Deleuze, we can see a break in, at least after the Nietzsche book, this deprivileging of interpretation, and more so a question of problems of method, or problems of functionality, right? What a text can do rather than what it means. Although that is not to sort of contradict what you said earlier about these questions of meaning and sense. It's just that interpretation isn't the end goal of philosophy either, because if it were, we might end up in a kind of linguistic analysis that I was bringing up earlier. And I think that that's the interesting thing, where analytic philosophers think that they're focusing on problems, but a lot of the times the problems seem to be problems of syntax, problems of logical analysis, which would again kind of turn it into, again, a kind of subdivision or auxiliary of linguistics, rather than problems more broadly, not necessarily having to function in a certain way or be formatted in a certain way in order to matter.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think there is a sense within sort of analytic tradition, and there's a lot of debate about this, which I touched some on some, about the rules are kind of already established. Often the rules of set theory, the rules of logic, the sort of the formal apparatus is generally kind of like chess. And I have that quote from Nagel in there where he admired the Vienna Circle because they were just sitting there like playing chess, kind of not worried about what was going on in the world, just kind of following the rules of logic and solving and working through problems in that way. Whereas I think the question for Deleuze is, where do these rules come from? And that's where there is in the second volume, I take up sort of the Wittgenstein rule following problem as another way of kind of getting back into some of these issues and connecting Deleuze in with some of those traditions. So yeah, no, you're right. That's a lot that's going. And in the analytic tradition, they don't feel like they need to do an exegesis on Quine, right? They don't have to. But they'll take up his critique of the analytic-continental, not the analytic, but the synthetic analytic distinction, for instance, and apply it to something else. But Deleuze does something similar. I mean, for him, I think his main problem is, I mean, as you mentioned in his pre-Nietzsche books, he was very much kind of concerned with an exegesis of philosophers, whether Bergson, Leibniz, Spinoza. But what he's doing with them is looking for the problem that guides their work.
You're right there. And, it is interesting, this notion of problematic idea, which I don't know if that's the best entrance into the work, but I think we covered a little bit of the intro and what's at stake. But I do like how you evolve the notion of the problematic idea bit by bit throughout the book, because there could be an info dump that could be overwhelming at the beginning. But I do like that you trace it not just back to Plato and the theory of ideas, but back to Kant, which I think is important. It's important to remember Deleuze's engagement with Kant, and to think of, Deleuze rightly or wrongly, but simply in a broad sense as post-Kantian, and to sort of frame it in the sense, that the Kant does, where problematic ideas are these problems without solutions. They can't be given an experience, etc. But as you just pointed out, and I think that your example of, this notion of this question of rules is, and this is where the determinant and the determinable and these other concepts come in. We can tackle little bits at a time, but I was thinking about how it was interesting, your point being made that the notion that Deleuze crafts and that you take up in the book can't be the problematic idea that Kant has, since it is, and I don't know, you could say this better than I could, but that it is subject to determinate rules, whereas for you and Deleuze, it gives rise to those rules.
Yeah.
And I know you could say this better than I can, so please take me with a grain of salt here.
No, I think you've described it well. I mean, I think one simplistic way of thinking about concepts is to think about them as providing you rules to apply predicates to a subject. And so if you know what a gardenia is, if you understand what a gardenia is, you can apply that predicate to all the different things you see out there. And that's kind of a Fregean notion of concepts and so on. But what it presupposes is already a kind of a rule for applying this concept to things. And that's problematic as you unpack it. And for Deleuze, he's attempting to understand that relationship. How do rules emerge? And that's where I focus on concepts such as learning, as Deleuze develops it in some of the areas in the book that I use to try to kind of unpack. Really, I think an underlying problem for a lot of Deleuze's work is, where does identity come from, whether in terms of rules or concepts or predicates or things, and he, as you all know, he throws the kitchen sink at it in difference in repetition and other places to try to get a handle on that idea, that problem.
This question, you're right, this question of identity, which, you know, Deleuze rightly points out how it always seems to win out in the end, and difference can never be found to have a concept of it, right where, and one of the quotes that recurs throughout the book, which I love, is the beginning lines of chapter 5 of Difference of Repetition, right? Difference is not diversity, you know, diversity is what, the givenness, well, no, sorry, difference is the givenness of the given, the way by which diversity is given. I totally butchered that, but I guess that what I think is interesting is, just to anticipate a little bit more, I was interested in how you start the first chapter, because we can build up to some of these other themes, but I like that it seems animating throughout this history of the analytic tradition, even going all the way back to Plato, and highlighting it in Kant was helpful, but readers might be familiar with the aporias and these things, but this question of infinite regress and how it animates a lot of the problems and a lot of the discussions and debates in the analytic tradition was very revealing to me. I mean, was there a moment when you saw that this was a thread that could organize some of these debates?
Yeah, that was. I think especially the notion that the way to end an infinite regress is just to take a brute fact. Like Wittgenstein said, that's where my spade is turned, and it's self-evident. That's where we stop. And then the problems with that move, right? Why stop there? How do we explain this brute fact, and so on? And so that is indeed kind of a thread that, as I did more and more of the research that ended up leading to this book, I found that refrain, so to speak, coming up again and again in different contexts and in different ways. So I said, I think there's something here I need to kind of explore some more. And the result of that exploration was this book.
It is interesting that you point out, it's something that I had forgotten. There's a lot to remember, but the 2 points where infinite regress most prominently plays in Deleuze, in Difference of Repetition and Logic of Sense. In chapter 5, to bring that up again in Difference of Repetition, again, on that first page, you bring up how Deleuze reads intensity as enveloping and enveloped in these series. And so I think for Deleuze, his problem is not that of trying to halt infinite regress.
Right.
I thought that was really interesting to bring forward. It's not something I had really focused my attention on, but I think that if we want to call this era of Deleuze 68, 69 a kind of serialism, why not? I mean, I think that for him, that's not necessarily the problem, that it, in fact, the problem is trying to halt the infinite regress. Is that fair to even like put it that way?
If we think about it, when does the regress become a problem. I think for many in the analytic, it becomes a problem if you're trying to ground knowledge, right? If you're trying to, like the third man argument that I focus on. If we want to explain this relation, but then we need another relation to explain that, and so on and so on, we never end up explaining what we wanted to explain in the first place. I think for Deleuze, the way around that is to not see it as a problem to begin with, simply because it's already presupposing the determinate relations between things when those can't be explained in a grounded way, right? You can't ground it in the way that gets the regress going.
It kind of reminds me of his discussion of the differential, which you go through in your work, but it seems as though he castigates certain, when he talks about kind of the barbaric history of infinitesimal calculus, he's citing certain mathematicians, Newton might be even ranked among this, who want to kind of take the infinitesimal and then say, well, it's equal to zero, when that actually completely wards off the possibility of a lot of the fruitfulness of a philosophical understanding of what's going on.
No, that's exactly right. And that when I talk about Deleuze and Bertrand Russell, they both wrote books on Leibniz. So it's kind of an interesting sort of overlap there, that they both found something important in Leibniz to write a book about. But the big difference between the two is that Russell kind of faults Leibniz in the end, because the micro perceptions are basically just unconscious perceptions that we haven't become aware of yet. Whereas for Deleuze, they are true infinitesimals that aren't to be confused with anything determinate. So as that ratio goes to infinity, it does become zero. The convention was to use 0 over 0, but it still maintains the ratio, right? It still maintains that intensive relationship. So, which is different in kind from the extensive numerical quantitative way of analysis that Russell was used to. I mean, as a mathematician and so on, that was kind of how he thought about things. But that was not the approach, at least as Deleuze reads Leibniz. That's not how Leibniz sets it out.
I think that's a good way of distinguishing between one of these tendencies that seems to predominate, not just in the analytic tradition, because we're not just doing an analytic bashing party over here. I will say, even if it might be easy, and we could obviously do the same to the continental side if we wanted to parody, but it does seem that, and we see this in on both sides of the dividing line. So maybe this is one way that there is, at least in the major mode, as Deleuze might call, this privileging of the determinate over what Deleuze, in thinking through difference, the virtual, is calling the determinable. And this is what you're getting at, where 0 over 0 is almost a stand-in for the very fact of dx dy still being in this determinable relationship, in this reciprocal determination. I thought that, and again, obviously it has many more implications, but I thought that was a nice way of foregrounding and maybe even putting into language that would be more familiar to the analytic tradition, this question of the virtual that Deleuze tries to articulate.
Yeah, that was my hope to, because I mean, I agree. I mean, I didn't want this book, and I hope it's not a analytic bashing.
No, it's not. I meant from me. I meant from on my end. I don't want to merely. Yeah. I'm not saying you do that. I don't want to bash them.
Yeah. I mean, I think Russell's great, and I do think that, I mean, as we know, Deleuze draws from science all the time, and the empirical results of science, and the determinate and the identifiable. But he also, as a philosopher, is more interested in, I think that's the key. As a philosopher, he's more interested in the conditions that made a lot of these things possible in the first place. I mean, that's why I think where Deleuze is a metaphysician. That's why the title of the book has metaphysics in it. I think at bottom, that's Deleuze is doing metaphysics. And analytic philosophers are doing a lot of metaphysics. I mean, they're doing some stuff 40 years ago. You would not have thought that analytic philosophers would be doing the kinds of things that they're doing today in terms of the questions and problems they take up. And I think that opened the field, so to speak, for greater communication between Deleuze and analytic philosophers, because people like David Lewis are really taking up the plurality of worlds. Or, I mean, there's worlds where I become a geologist that's real. It's just not the one that's actual. I mean, all these kinds of claims are interesting claims, and they have arguments behind them and so on and so forth. So I found that as I did this work, that there was a lot of resonance between the two perspectives that I'm taking up, sort of the Deleuzian relevance question perspective and the analytic scientific truth questions. And I think this is true for Deleuze's work as well. Is you want to be careful about making these rigid dualities, either ors. I see these as tendencies as opposed to predeterminate and determining dualities. And I think that's the non-Hegelian aspect of Deleuze's work.
In Latin, there's two ways of saying either or, right? There's sive, right? In like Spinoza's Deus sive natura, it's not an exclusive disjunction. But then there's out, ... out, right? Which is a kind of exclusive disjunction between two things. And so I was thinking about this in Pierre Macheret's Hegel or Spinoza, right? And so there's a way of reading that as a kind of inclusive disjunction, or as a kind of, and I think this is sort of how Deleuze does his minor line of reading the history of philosophy, as a kind of exclusive disjunction. And in other places, in Anti-Oedipus, for example, he wants to privilege the inclusive, but to a certain extent, I think that in in Deleuze's philosophy or history of philosophy, there is no kind of compromise between the two. But now I'm going to do Hegel bashing, and that's not really fair either. That's not really germane to the topic. I was just thinking about how, yes, there's a way in which we can think of the inclusive disjunction or exclusive disjunction as showing, again, that there isn't a necessity of sort of choosing to pick sides between the analytic and the continental, as you kind of make clear. And you made, and I do think that maybe Deleuze is that kind of dark precursor that's able to like flash between the systems and provide a kind of mediation that can shed light on perhaps how some of the problems that at least began, and you trace it back to 1898 or something with Bradley and Moore and Russell, this birth of the analytic tradition, how what Deleuze helps to show is how some of those problems maybe could have been circumvented by being shown to be false problems. And again, not to bash, but just in the sense that like Bergson says them. So maybe badly determined problems or something like this.
That's good. Yeah, I think one way to talk about that sort of inclusive disjunction is to think about the relationship between problems and solutions. So I think there is, in analytic philosophy, but also perhaps in science or logic, there's a tendency to think that a problem disappears with the solution. So like you give checkmate in 5 moves is a kind of chess problem. And then once you figure out the 5 moves, you solve the problem, and then the problem's gone. And so there's the sense that once you come to a solution to the problem, you no longer have the problem. So that's kind of like a disjunction there. Whereas I think for Deleuze, in his understanding of problems, the problem doesn't disappear with the solution. The problem exceeds the solutions that it makes possible. And it's because of that, and that's where the determinable comes in again, because the determinable is like this thing that's multiply realizable. Blue as a determinable can be realized in a bunch of different shades of blue, in that same sort of vein. And same for problems. Problems can be determined in a bunch of different determinate solutions. So it's not an either or there, but there is a difference, an important difference. So it's kind of an inclusive disjunction, to use your term. That's right. That's good.
Well, it's not my turn. I'm stealing it.
Well, I know.
But he would, but I mean, I'm just thinking of how Guattari talks about I am a thought thief. We encourage piracy of thinking on the happy hour. To circle back around, which I'm sure we'll be doing, right, in the tortuous spiraling that Deleuze's thinking can be, and I like that there is a bit of tortuousness in your work as we kind of circle through, even if it follows a bit of a chronology, not always, but sometimes it is recursively going back over these problems and enriching them. I'm thinking about, I said earlier, I guess I didn't specify, the other place where infinite regress doesn't seem to necessarily be a problem for Deleuze, but in fact a kind of given if we are to assert a kind of paradoxical image of thought rather than an orthodox one is when he looks at Lewis Carroll. I think it's in the 4th series of Logic of Sense, and he's talking about how sense cannot be said in the very proposition, right? There's always a name that denotes the sense of the previous expression, etc. So there's always at least 2 terms for a series, and it only takes 2 turns to lead to this sort of indefinite regress. I think that's the language he uses, this language of the indefinite rather than the infinite. And I don't think that necessarily is a problem if we allow for the paradoxical to sort of reign, right? That crowned anarchy that we could say too.
And there's also is it the 5th series, the Paradox of Sense series, where he talks the paradox of regress? Yeah, where we can never state the sense of what we say,
right,
but we can always use another statement to refer to that sense. But then that statement won't have stated its own sense. And then we go on, and that's where that regress gets going. And you're right, for Deleuze, that's not a problem. That's, in fact, that gives the power of language to continually refer to itself and to what it's saying. And it also kind of ties into the fact that sense is not to be confused with the statements that express it.
Right.
So there's kind of,
and that's back to the problem solution correlate that we were discussing.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that's a nice way. I think that's one of the things that's really interesting too, that because I think that now difference repetition obviously brings up a lot of thinkers, but in Logic of Sense, you do see some of these names from the analytic tradition coming up. Mm-hmm. We see Russell and like the barber's paradox, right? The barber of the regiment. Does he shave himself if he's a part of the regiment, right? He's the barber is defined as the one who does not shave himself, or only
he shaves all men who doesn't shave themselves.
Right. Okay. Thank you. So he brings up Russell. We see Meinong coming in with this question of the subsistence of events, or the subsistence of these surface effects of the incorporeal transformations, right? That he takes from the Stoics and that you bring up throughout your work. And I'm trying to think. I think Frege comes up at least once. There's not a complete rejection of the analytic tradition from Deleuze, and you also bring in some figures that are grouped in the continental tradition, but that may seem to have a home more in the analytic. Someone like Husserl, who plays a key role in the Logic of Sense. So if I were to sort of put a footnote in your book, I'd be like, hey, Logic of Sense too helps to bring out a lot of these. At least if this were a book merely on Deleuze, right? Deleuze in the analytic tradition, that's to me where I would go, or at least urge for further reading analytic philosophers to go, to see perhaps Deleuze paradoxically, not to pun, at his most, at least alone at his most literary, but also dealing with these problems that seem to animate the analytic tradition, even if he handles them otherwise.
I mean, I think that is a good way to kind of think about Deleuze and the relationship to analytic tradition by way of Husserl, because you're right, early on, I mean, Husserl and Frege corresponded with one another. They were taking up similar problems in the philosophy of mathematics. And even Russell, and early on, there was a thought that Husserl was one of them, sort of this kind of neo-realist tradition that Russell and others in the early 20th century kind of saw themselves as being a part of. It really was Heidegger that kind of turned a lot of people in the analytic tradition against sort of what was going on in Europe. And Husserl always sort of had a kind of soft spot in some of the people's minds for that. So you're right, I could have gone there. And interestingly, it's pretty easy to go from Husserl to Sartre, and from Sartre to Deleuze, because the whole notion of transcendental consciousness, and then you have Sartre's transcendence of the ego, and then you have Deleuze's whole concept of the transcendental field in his late writings. I mean, there's a kind of a lineage there that you can trace from Husserl up to the late Deleuze. And they're taking up very similar problems. How do things get constituted before our consciousness or our experience? And for Husserl, you needed the transcendental ego to do that. For Sartre, you didn't. And for Deleuze, you don't even need consciousness anymore.
Right. No, you're right. That's the series, and that's also, as you said, in Logic of Sense, that Deleuze traces that and wants to follow Sartre, but dropping out consciousness as this necessary constituent. And I do think that it's nice too, as you point out in the work, with going back to this question of the determinate and the determinable, it's precisely Deleuze wanting to start with pre-individual singularities as a way of continuing this differential philosophy, if we want to put it that way, of thinking through the differential and the singular points that sort of constitute the what would become the sort of the extensive forms out of those relations. All of that. I didn't have a question there. I'm just sort of thinking in tandem with you. And you said something earlier, though, that I really thought was key. And I think sometimes it gets lost in the sort of panoply of Deleuzean categories and concepts and themes. And it's this one that has always been kind of dear to me. And I think we've discussed it a little bit on the show, but I'll bring it out again, where it is this Deleuze's privileging of learning over knowledge. And it is this, which also he puts in terms of the differential, where in the waves and the swimming and these other things. But I was just thinking about how this privileging of learning over knowledge is a theme that is kind of dear to my heart. And it goes back to the problem solution correlation that we talked about, because it's precisely insofar as problems are ready made and handed down to us from above, and we don't have the autonomy to formulate problems, that we privilege knowledge in a certain way, as though it were regurgitating answers on a test. But it's when we have the authority to determine problems and thereby derive the solutions we deserve based on those determinations, that there's something like learning going on.
I think learning helps Deleuze to kind of figure out a way of conceptualizing and thinking through the process involved with taking a multiplicity and turning it into something determinate and identifiable. So like the swimming example that you brought up, there's all these different factors at play: currents, buoyancy in the water, things to do with one's body. And you have to, on the one hand, kind of unlearn things before, right? What I call de-differentiate, right? You can't do with your body what you do on land in the water. Right. That's not going to work. But then you have to figure out what is relevant to the new skill that is going to emerge, if it's going to emerge. And that's the problem. The problem is selection and creating this sort of plane of consistency of the issues involved with the problem. And only then will it make a solution possible. And so it's that intervening step here between not having a problem and then the solution. What creates the problem? And that's the other thing for Deleuze. Problems have to be created. They are not out there in the sort of Platonic world waiting for us to discover them. We create them in our social and intellectual contexts and environments.
That was a good point to bring out. And I think you articulate this, if not early on, then at least later when Kant comes back around at the end of the book, where one thing that I hadn't really thought about, but makes sense, where, and correct me if I'm wrong, or at least sort of work with me here, because I'm learning, it's interesting. It's not, as Deleuze said, it's not learn from me, but learn with me. It's a doing with rather than a replication or a resemblance. But I was thinking about how you bring out this fact that perhaps for not just Kant, but for a lot of this tradition that privileges the determinant, as you said, problems would already sort of pre-exist or be out there or be given. Would for Kant problematic ideas be something similar, where they would sort of already be given in the transcendental constitution of, the mind, and so they wouldn't necessarily be created?
Yeah, I mean, like, for instance, the idea of the world as a kind of problematic idea. It's kind of presupposed by scientific research, by our making sense of things in the world, and so on and so forth, even though it can never be an object of experience. And so that's the sense in which it's a problem without a solution. But it's still, and I think this is where Deleuzean critique comes in, it still has a kind of unity that mirrors the unity of experience. And that's where it's adopting the things from experience and bringing it back in as a kind of way of understanding the problems. And I think that's where Deleuze will break with Kant. And I think you mentioned it earlier when we talked about Kant also presupposes the certain kind of pure concepts of pure categories as a kind of rules that determine the synthesis of representations and so on. And for Deleuze again, the question is, how do these rules come about? And that's again where the learning. But the learning is, I think at one point in the book I talk about, or maybe it's in the other book, I talk about learning to drive a stick shift car, which no one learns anymore. I don't know if you could buy a stick shift car if you wanted to, at least not a new car. But you've got, I mean, it's a very simple example. I remember I first learned to drive a stick shift car in New Orleans, which is not a city to learn to drive a stick shift car in.
The Louisiana roads are a little rough. I'm not going to, sorry to disparage the great state of Louisiana, but if you've driven through Louisiana, some of those roads are a bit rough.
Especially in New Orleans, the potholes and all that.
Well, yeah.
But in order to learn it, you have to, I mean, it's stated as a rule, it seems fairly straightforward, right? You press down the clutch, change the gear, release the clutch while you press the gas, then you're off and running. So you can state it as a simple rule, but anyone who has learned to drive a stick shift car knows it's much harder than that. And that actually, I think, captures the sort of the complexity of the intensive processes associated with problems, right? That it's, yes, once you learn the rule, you can retrospectively look back and say, yep, that's what I did. But during the process of learning, there's a lot more stuff going on. And I think that is at the heart of what Deleuze's project is all about. What is that stuff going on that makes these determinate rules and identities possible?
That's a good way of putting it. I like that. And I was just thinking about how, this question of problems and solutions, and generally the hierarchy of solutions over problems, which not just occurs in difference of repetition, but we see it come back up at least in A Thousand Plateaus with the dominance of what they call royal science or major science, which kind of privileges the theorematic and the axiomatic over the problematic. And I was thinking about how one of the phrases that Deleuze talks about this is this tracing. I think you were intimating this tracing of problems from solutions.
Yeah.
And I think he has a funny quote from Aristotle, which is something like about how questions are propositions, just with kind of an inflection of the voice. At the end, you can imagine just our voice raising at the end, and that turns a sort of proposition into a question, as though, and I think that's kind of used as maybe a slightly ridiculous, an example of how the problem is treated as a kind of accident or a kind of after image, an epiphenomenon, if you will, of solutions.
Yeah, no, you're right. I think in What is Philosophy, they talk about sort of the solution always haunts the problem from the get-go. And at least in the analytic tradition, everything is reducible to propositions and propositional functions. And those functions work by basically plugging in a determinate value or argument to give us a truth value. And it kind of misses the whole notion of relations between determinate things in the first place, which is the problem that Deleuze is trying to, I think, figure out, trying to understand.
And that does seem to give a new twist, and that just came to mind, this twist to the what is privileging in truth problems. Because if all of this can be reduced to propositionality, then the what is question is the key question. But also it seems as though that would privilege the extensive and the measurable and the denumerable over the questions that are questions of relevance. For example, how much, and how much obviously can be reformulated in a metric way when we consider, for example, length. This is where Russell shows up in A Thousand Plateaus in the apparatus of capture, when they talk about the axiomatic, where they actually turn to Russell and say, there's a difference between length and distance. Or, for example, they use the example of height. We can think of temperature as well, but they talk about altitude. If we just measure it as a length, then okay, that's metric. But falling from 10 feet on your face and falling from 20, it's not necessarily a simple metric difference. True. There is a difference in intensity. And I think they take this example straight from Russell.
And Deleuze takes up, which I also take up in the book, the left hand in the mirror example.
Right.
Won't fit the left-handed glove, which is in part to show that our extensive concepts don't capture what's really going on. So that's the lesson Deleuze draws from that. To pick up on the point about the what is questions and how those can go on and on, as I begin the second volume, but it's related to what we're talking about here, I start with Camus' essay on Myth of Sisyphus, where in that essay they talk about the apartment manager who committed suicide 5 years after his daughter had died. And the question was, well, what was going on? And Camus says thought undermined him. And so the question, well, what was going on there? And if you take that and if you take what Deleuze talks about jealousy and some of the Proust quotes where he talks about Proust, where the jealous person, even if you find out that your partner had cheated and you can answer the what is X question, is it true? Yes, they cheated. That is not the end of the questions, right?
No.
You can go when, where, what other circumstances, who else, how often, why.
Yeah.
These questions kind of without end. And actually Proust says in the Remembrance of Things Past that you have to put a stop to that kind of thinking because it will go to the four corners of the universe if you allow it. And that's sort of, again, back to the notion of sense as this kind of infinite regress that doesn't have a natural ground to it. Whereas the analytic philosophers and most people in the sciences want to have a grounding for scientific claims and the points that they make. And in fact, like the third page of Difference and Repetition, Deleuze talks about how it's not surprising that science works well with mathematics because they've already kind of told us in advance, these are the kinds of truths that we're going to accept within the sort of parameters of a quantitative mathematical perspective.
That is good. And what I thought was interesting, and this is why, and I'm glad you bring it up in your book, what I thought was interesting is that as we get along in what I mentioned earlier with this birth of analytic philosophy with Bradley, Moore, Russell, I'm sure there are others in there, but this question of the recurring question that you have of monism or pluralism, right? And it reminded me, of course, of the bold letters we get in the introduction rhizome of A Thousand Plateaus, where they kind of say monism equals pluralism because, and I even wrote down the quote, but we've kind of been talking about this where they kind of say, look, obviously we're invoking these dualisms, but the point is not to sort of rigidify them and fixate on them, but to treat them as provisional tools to push through them and to make a passage. Almost we can think about, again, the point of the differential of dx and dy is not to really privilege either one of the terms, right? But to look at the determinable relation among them. So I guess that would be, maybe we can spend a second talking about this tendency, which you've hinted at a little bit when I brought up Spinoza earlier. I can't remember if monism, I know you bring up monism as Spinoza and you put Bradley on that side, and we can talk about the analytic side, but is it Hume that's on the side of pluralism? Yes. Okay, let's talk a little bit about that.
It's kind of interesting. Yeah, I think that was one way I had of sort of figuring out for myself this sort of enigmatic claim, monism equals pluralism. And if you look at sort of the history of Deleuze's own writings, he wrote a lot on Spinoza, and Spinoza was a big hero of his, but he also was very influenced by Hume. And it seems like Hume, as we talked earlier, never quite bit the bullet because he accepted the reality of distinct individuals, whereas Spinoza does not, at least on De La Rocca's reading. The question to ask is, well, why is Deleuze, what does he get from both? And the answer to that question, I think, also answers the question, what does monism equal pluralism mean? And the answer in short, I guess, is that from Spinoza, they get the importance of immanence, an immanence that's not to be confused with anything extensive or determinate, right? God is not, there's no determinate limits to God in Spinoza, because if there were, then there would be something God is not.
Right.
And that would automatically kind of put it in the category of the finite. And so pure immanence is going to be something that cannot be thought of in terms of finite determinate categories. So there's one way in which we get beyond the determinate by going full hog Spinoza. But then where does Hume come in? Well, Hume comes in with respect to this sort of pre-individual singularities and how they come together to constitute a problem that allows
given, yeah, right.
Merge. So I think that's where the Hume side comes in. And so it's monism equals pluralism because it's both immanent and not to be confused with anything determinate and finite. And yet it is a multiplicity at the same time from Deleuze's perspective. So I think that is how he draws from both Spinoza and Hume in a lot of his own work.
I suppose that this could be a pause to go deeper because and you could help me with this. I was trying to follow, I'll need some help understanding Bradley's point, but Bradley is trying to stake a claim in the Spinozist vein of not being distinctions in reality that are quote unquote real. That relations, for example, and qualities being something of appearance, not that they don't necessarily exist, but they're not real in the sense in which monism would allow. Whereas the solution that Moore and then Russell seem to take up is, whether they miss Bradley's point or not, but is to stake, and you said this earlier, to say that there is, because Bradley's trying to avoid the infinite regress in his own way, right? Of what we've been talking about. Whereas Moore and Russell want to say that the ground is brute, sort of natural fact, what Deleuze might call common sense to a certain extent, right? That there is an obviousness of these presuppositions, we might call them, objective or subjective, but there is this ground, this brute natural fact, which, as you show, is very problematic on its own end. And I'm sure that it has political consequences because then it becomes arbitrary. You trace this even all the way back to Locke, countering the naturalist arguments of monarchy. So I guess maybe help me a little bit with Bradley's argument, if you will.
There was a debate that Bradley and Russell had in the early, like 1911, 1912, published in The Monist. And Bradley was actually surprised that Russell thought Bradley's work was opposed to science. And all Bradley's point is that everything we know is incomplete. Everything we know depends upon something that is not included in what we know. And the more we try to explain what it is we know, we have to include more. And so nothing in and by itself as a distinct finite individual is self-explanatory. You need to go beyond it if you want to explain it. And so either that goes on infinitely, which is where you get the regress, or there is just one reality, and these are all appearances of that one reality.
There's God, there's substance, Deus sive natura.
And that's where Bradley's book, Appearance and Reality, gets its title, right? The appearances are of change of finite things, and science deals with that. But the only reality that is self-explanatory is the one reality. It's the one that doesn't need to go outside itself. Everything else in appearance has its knowledge or its reality by virtue of something else. Russell and Moore, just whether intentionally or not, I think partly it was because they were trying to found mathematics and science, and they rely on these sort of brute facts. And as you say, it has its own problems. There's been a resurgence of kind of interest in Bradley of late. I mean, there's several other people that have been kind of bringing him in, and Bradley himself admits that he was not a good logician. So
that's interesting too. So yeah, I guess that it seems as though Bradley was able to bite the Spinozist bullet, whether he thought of himself as a Spinozist or not. I'm not sure if he characterized himself in that way. I thought it was interesting that someone had falsely characterized him as a Hegelian, when that does seem to. And the monist is I laugh because I thought that was ironic, that maybe privileging the monism that Bradley is espousing. But I guess that one thing that I thought was interesting, that you say that Russell first takes up this problem in the Principia Mathematica, and it reminds me precisely of this concern of founding mathematics and avoiding the indeterminate or avoiding this incompleteness. We see later a mathematician and logician like Gödel kind of crushing that dream and kind of maybe proving Bradley right to a certain extent, despite his arguments, or just in addition to or alongside, very much through mathematical means.
At one point, Russell claimed that most important idea that he had been working on throughout his entire career was proving that relations are external to their terms. Which is a very Deleuzian claim, right? Deleuze
it's the Hume-Deleuze connection.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But for Russell, what that means is, for example, if you say X is greater than Y, you can take that relation and you can replace X and Y by a bunch of different variables and come out with true statements. So in other words, the relation has to be independent of the numbers you plug into the variables in order for math to work. But that's not how Deleuze is going to approach the relations that are external to their terms. It's going to be sort of intensive relations are external to the
right
come to be identified.
That's a really straightforward way of putting it, that the externality of relations being this question of difference of intensity. And as Deleuze says, difference of intensity is a tautology, but whatever. He says it himself. It's the disparate.
Yeah.
Right. I think that's a phrase that Deleuze uses. And I think that he gets it from Simondon in this notion of a disparation, of a kind of a mediation between incommensurable systems. And he sees that through his notion of information. I'm just thinking out loud because I'm thinking about how, it's precisely one of the things that Simondon wants to question is the very fact that insofar as philosophy tends to privilege terms, it can't think ontogenesis, right? Because it's already dealing with individuated segments. So it's already in the extensive, it's in the determinate, as you put it. We have to go into this theory. You can't form a principle of individuation based on the individuated being, right? We have to go to another realm or a different realm, and that involves breaking up hylomorphism, et cetera, et cetera. I know I'm getting off track. I just was trying to connect it to some of the contemporary milieu in which Deleuze is thinking.
I think you're right. I mean, I think that was well said, and I think Simondon is a clear influence at play in what Deleuze is doing as well. So I think you're exactly right about that. And I think that was one of the reasons Simondon was so important. It was one of the ways, it was an ally in his quest to figure out a way of understanding individuation without presupposing individuals.
And, Simondon really does fit into this. It makes sense that Simondon is an ally in this very theme, this thematics that you're working through with the Analytic-Continental divide. I really do feel like Simondon, at least setting aside that, the divide between, or the relation between science and philosophy, there is a way in which, as I said earlier, and we talked about, philosophy can be collapsed, that relation could collapse into a kind of monism where philosophy needs to imitate or be science. Even Husserl had that kind of dream of philosophy as rigorous science in his own way, which maybe is another way that he kind of aligns with the tradition of science. But there's a sense in which Simondon doesn't want to necessarily collapse that wants to preserve a role for philosophy, even if for him it's kind of lagging behind the sciences precisely because of this privileging of the determinate or of the individuated. And I think that that's what his goal is to try to do, and that you point out too, and that is a theme in Deleuze and in thinkers like Laruelle, where it's this question of asking, how is it that the sciences, the mathematics, the arts have been able to undergo these mutations, be it Euclidean or Riemannian or, 12-tone serialism, abstract art. But philosophy has kind of resisted this or remained in this representative mode or this extensive mode or the determinate mode. And what would it take to push it to undergo these kinds of movements, these kinds of transitions and changes and mutations?
Yeah, I mean, those are important questions. And early on in my earlier work, like my Edge of Chaos book, and there's a pretty wide literature of trying to think of Deleuze in sort of dynamic systems approaches. So using kind of science as a way of kind of making sense of what Deleuze is doing. Like Manuel Delanda does a lot of that as well. And there is something to be said for that, in the sense I think it provides a sort of a heuristic for thinking through Deleuze's problems and how he approaches those problems. But I think the mistake is to think that we have solved what Deleuze is doing if we think of it in just sort of these sort of dynamic systems approaches, because it's still a scientific representational model that's being used here, when at bottom Deleuze is critical of all representational models, or it's not that he's critical of it, it's just that's what needs to be explained. And you can't just simply use them to explain things. They need to be explained. But once you've gone on and explained them, you can certainly use dynamic systems theory and all these other scientific models. And that's, I think, going back to Simondon, I think Simondon probably has a similar kind of ambivalence with respect to his relationship to science, draws on it heavily with crystallization and so on and so forth, but also sees that philosophy is doing something different.
I agree with that. Yeah, it's what can philosophy learn from the sciences without it needing to be either a kind of battlefield, as Kant might say it, right? That metaphysics takes place on a battlefield where there's a struggle whereby philosophy is trying to one up science with saying, like Heidegger even does this in Being and Time, where it's like the crisis in the sciences, you need a phenomenology, a sort of fundamental ontology to base it. So philosophy is trying to sort of, it's always kind of been at this in the struggle because it can't perform well. The creation of concepts is not the same as the creation of functions, as Deleuze might say, but it can't take us as a straightforward path to these questions. You might say it this way, right? It can't afford itself merely the questions of truth and false. It has to ask these more roundabout, indirect, open-ended questions of relevance that we discussed earlier. And if it tries to forego that, then I think we're doing metaphysics in the bad sense. Because I think Deleuze, as you pointed out, I mean, he himself said he's doing metaphysics. He considers himself a metaphysician. But there's a sense in which metaphysics can be done in the bad way, in the transcendent way, in ways that would rely on some sort of God as a guarantor of truth or whatever. And what maybe Deleuze brings up, and this is another part of the paradox, or what you call the cognitive dissonance of something like transcendental empiricism, which I'd love to discuss with you for a second, because I really thought you building up, and this is what I meant before we started, the book goes in these peaks and valleys, and sometimes Deleuze appears above the clouds in these peaks of intensity in your book to help to further deepen and sometimes resolve some of these questions that you've gone through the analytic tradition to sort of explore. And one of those things, when you bring up transcendental empiricism, I think in chapter 13, I really liked that you begin by kind of saying, look, it's easy to see this. You say there's a cognitive dissonance perhaps experienced by Kantians when they see this, right? Because it yokes together seeming opposites. And for me, I almost always thought of it as perhaps for this very fact that Deleuze seizes upon this term and as almost an inside joke, where we are yoking together the transcendental as conditions of possibility of experience, blah, 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 and empiricism. Do you want to say a little bit about that phrasing in your, because it reminds me a little bit of what you were saying when you first see monism equals pluralism. It's kind of like, what the fuck's going on here?
Yeah.
Maybe we could talk a little bit about that.
Early conference, when I gave a Deleuze paper and I mentioned transcendental empiricism, one of the questions was, isn't that an oxymoron? And I do think it does on the surface seem that way. But if we think about experience and empiricism as being based upon what is given, the given experience, the transcendental side of empiricism is what accounts for the givenness of the givens. Right, which you mentioned earlier, it's difference by way of which the given is given. And that's the transcendental empiricism right there. So that, I mean, much of what he's doing is transcendental empiricism, trying to account for the givenness of the given, where it comes to be the empirical as such. And that is a fundamental part of his project, I think.
And that's where you emphasize this move from, and part of this we already highlighted in Logic of Sense, right? Moving from Husserl to Sartre to, and he credits Simondon with a new theory of the transcendental. In this really nice footnote in Logic of Sense, where he lays out some of the things that he takes from him, like pre-individual singularities, like dispiration, etc. But I was just thinking about how, you know, for Deleuze, it's this move. And I think that he's trying to continue the great quest to complete German idealism to a certain extent, right? This dissatisfaction with merely conditions of possible experience towards these genetic conditions of real experience. And one of the themes of which is this genitality of thinking, right? That thinking is not innate or required, which gets us back into these kind of universal subjects of, with these subjective presuppositions. But that there is a violence that forces thinking to be born within thought, right? Yeah. That's part of what I was seeing in you discussing these themes of this genetic impulse, this genetic search for the conditions of real experience.
And this gets back to the learning again as well, because I think, man, I could go on and on, but briefly, you can go all the way back to Plato to talk about the sort of paradox is what motivates us to think. And so there's kind of an encounter, and that's really becoming, right? Becoming is kind of paradoxical in Plato's mind, because it's both being and not being at the same time. And the minute we try to think it and apply a stable category to it, it doesn't work. So, but we can't help but encounter becoming. And so that's the paradox that gets us to think. And then in Difference of Repetition, they talk about learning as our encountering a problem, right? Learning is what's going on as we encounter a problem. So it's really, problems are the sort of encounters that motivate us to think. And so you're right. I think that is, and I think that's what philosophy is. I'm basically, my thesis in my book on what is philosophy is that they're creating a concept of pedagogy. In fact, that's how they end the introduction to that book. And it has three components: science, art, and philosophy. And each of them, there's a way of encountering chaos and responding to that encounter in a way that creates something stable. So in art, it's creating perception and affects. In science, you're creating representational models. And in philosophy, you're creating concepts. But in both cases, it's an encounter with sort of chaos that kind of prompts and provokes the thinking or the creative process that leads to the various consequences of science, art, and philosophy.
I like that you brought up the end of that introduction, because it is, the stakes are laid out very clearly there, where if on one side there is this notion of, again, as I kind of mentioned it earlier, philosophy is almost an adjunct or an auxiliary to science, whereby it would be a kind of encyclopedia. If pedagogy keeps us from, again, this kind of collapse of philosophy into science or onto science, whereby it becomes encyclopedia, that's so as we don't fall into the depths of this kind of commercialization of the concept, or its sort of reduction to information, that, as Deleuze kind of declares, like, the death of philosophy for him isn't a problem, but its death would merely be if we allow for the very fact that, what he says, like, who else has concepts except for like advertisers or something, right?
That marketing man.
Marketing. So I think for Deleuze, this is the question where, if it really were between science being, if the alternative were merely science, philosophy as encyclopedia, the diametrical opposite would be philosophy as kind of marketing. And I think that that's where pedagogy keeps us, is the tightrope we have to walk from sort of either a base commercialism or, an identity with science and a competition with it, right? As though philosophy would compete with it on grounds of truth, right? Truth values, and claim to know the real better than science itself, which is what I think you bringing up Hawking in your introduction is a good indicator for, right? Where it's, Hawking thinks that philosophy is in competition with science. And sometimes philosophy has acted this way, right? That it would compete with science to know the real, or something like this, to know reality better than science knows it itself. And I think on that ground, philosophy loses. And this is why, too, I love this. Again, this bookends your, this is in the intro and the conclusion to your work, where you sort of bring up Kant's lamentation that you mentioned earlier, that philosophy hasn't really seemed to get this universal and lasting acclaim. One can question even why the philosopher is, narcissistically complaining about this. It's kind of funny in a certain way, but in general, it makes sense. And it makes sense that even Kant, thought of metaphysics as the queen of the sciences. So even there is this kind of one-upsmanship going on. And maybe that even motivates something like his critique of pure reason, and trying to like set up the synthetic a priori and all these things, that as though there was a little bit of this drive to compete. And I think that that's partly what I really like about this work that you're as you say, you're setting up for the political consequences for thinking through these questions, and that we shouldn't necessarily sort of stake our ground on terrain, on the battlefield of the enemy, if you will. Well, that's not even fair, because science isn't the enemy, but it's as though philosophy has sometimes let itself think that it were the enemy, and that's not the battlefield that it needs to fight.
There's a passage in Bertrand Russell's Problems of Philosophy where he talks about, if you ask a geologist, chemist, physicist, what they've learned in the last 100, 200 years, they could go on and on and on and telling you all the things that they have learned in the last 200 years. But then if you ask a philosopher what they have learned in the last 200 years, they couldn't tell you much, he said. And I think Russell kind of sharing in Kant's sort of disappointment with philosophy. But I also think it also betrays what's going on here, that there's a certain sense in which what counts as knowledge and legitimate in the sort of scientific concept is a kind of quantitative knowing more about X. Whereas if philosophy is understood more as this kind of process of learning, it sets the stage for doing that. So it's not like it's the enemy. It's just that in order for, and I don't know if this is true, I want to believe that it's true, that Einstein had read Hume in the months prior to having his breakthrough on special relativity. And I want to believe that because it tells me that philosophy provides a sort of fertile ground for learning and for very open to thinking about things differently, new concepts and so on. And science stands to benefit from philosophy, just as philosophy can benefit from science. I mean, they're not enemies. They're kind of in a reciprocal relation in ways.
I was just thinking about how, this is off topic, but Simondon, in an early essay that he wrote, I don't think he ever published it, on the epistemology of cybernetics, he's trying to think about how cybernetics could potentially allow for a theory of operations that would be a sort of mediator between the particular sciences that study structures. And I was thinking a little bit about that when I was reading your book, whereby the relevance questions could be likened more to these understandings of operations, of conversions of structures into structures, whereas the sciences, the particular sciences, quote unquote, and perhaps this privileging of the what is question on behalf of someone like Russell would be more concerned with structures and mathematical structures, for example. So I guess that would be this kind of way in which, gosh, I suppose that if with Russell the mathematical is the queen that should lead the way for philosophy, I think that it's funny that Deleuze takes him up on that quest, but in ways that reads what mathematics can tell us and lead to the, as I mentioned earlier, this differential philosophy. There's interestingly, that's one of the hardest chapters, right? The ideas, and I know it's translated differently. I know it's like ideal synthesis of difference. I had the book over here, but anyway, that fourth chapter where he dives deep into the history of calculus, as we mentioned earlier. I don't think that mathematics is the model to follow for philosophy. That's, again, to lose its identity and its originality, but it can teach us about the intensive, as we've been discussing.
As Dan Smith and others have written on the whole Deleuze and the math and the calculus, that I think it is definitely a way in which Deleuze was able to think through that relationship between the intensive and the extensive. But that doesn't mean that mathematics is the solution, right? I think that's the mistaken move that not everyone makes, but some people I think make with respect to Deleuze, that all we need now is the mathematical, and then we've got Deleuze figured out.
It makes sense that a mathematician like Russell, again, not to bash him, but it makes sense. This is biographical maybe, but again, this is perhaps back to the narcissism, that a mathematician would then extend the domain and say philosophy should just be math.
Yeah.
It's in a different way. It reminds me, because this talk of bridging the analytic-continental divide, I know a lot of Badouzians have seen, and Badiou himself has kind of seen his own work, like with being an event, is trying to bridge this divide. But there's also a way that Badiou does something that I think threatens the integrity of philosophy by wanting to by wanting to cut off from philosophy ontology, right? Ontology is mathematics, and that's its own domain, and philosophy is really just the custodian of the collective milieu of the truth conditions. Again, that's outside of the purview a little bit, but it's related. This question of resolving the analytical and the continental and forming a harmony. I think the way Badiou does it, though, is a bit violent to, as I mentioned, kind of the integrity of philosophy, but not really to disparage him. It's just to try to understand this interesting notion that philosophy's gotten wrong for thousands of years by being concerned with ontology. Really, it's set theory that gets us there.
Interesting as he is, I do think he has some key misunderstandings of what Deleuze's project is
Sure.
about. But you're right, he does certainly draw heavily on mathematics. And I haven't read his recent book where he's taking up category theory and trying to capitalize on it. But there's a whole trend in philosophy that goes back to Pythagoras. There's this whole notion that kind of the Pythagorean mathematical insight, it has a certain kind of privileged access to reality and truth. I think that has, especially people who've done mathematics and have had those insights and intuitions into seeing a proof put out on the board and seeing how Pythagorean theorem is true not only of this, but of every other possible right triangle, et cetera.
Right.
That has had a powerful sway over philosophers looking for the key to unlock the nature of reality and stuff like that. And I don't fault anyone for that, because that's kind of what philosophers are trying to do. They're trying to understand why and how things work the way they do. So mathematics, you can understand why it would be a go-to for many people.
There's a quote from Pythagoras that's kind of seared in my brain that I remember. Numbers are the essence of all things and the metaphysical principle of the rational order of the universe, right? And so, like, if you believe that, and one can see, if you believe that not just intellectually but spiritually, one can see how that would be a sort of initiatory mantra into the Eleatic mysticism that Pythagoreanism is kind of associated with. Again, wasn't a question, just kind of an aside. We have covered a lot of ground. Now, I know we haven't necessarily delved into the dozens of analytic philosophers that we have talked about, but maybe I would allow us to start to anticipate some more of the political implications that lead into the companion volume. Since I mentioned to you, I haven't had a chance to read it, but you do provide for a little bit of that overarching trajectory, sort of explaining why, kind of in the sense that you're not just concerned with sort of epistemological quibbles. And there is a sense in which it is, I don't want to say these problems because we've been using that term too much, but these interrogations of the analytic tradition bears fruit in the political domain and for political reflection. So maybe we can start to sketch the ground, and I can try to play catch up so I can interact with you on this. But yeah, tell us about this companion volume, or how you lead into it.
We've talked about it a little bit earlier. One of the key insights from this first volume that I'm trying to stress is this notion of the tradition in analytic philosophy to end the regress with brute facts. And the problem with that being that you end up with certain arbitrary claims. And so the connection with politics becomes the connection with sort of arbitrary power, where power is simply grounded on arbitrary means. And so I do mention that with Locke, as we talked about earlier. But what I stress more in the second volume is the role that narratives play in our construction of worldview and our sense of meaning, and how narrative can take on the aspect of being a solution without a problem, simply explains things without question, and we just sort of take that to be the way things are. So a kind of example I use, which I relate with being here in South Louisiana, Arlie Hochschild wrote a book, Strangers in Their Own Land, several years ago. She's a sociologist from Berkeley, and she went to live in Lake Charles, Louisiana for 4 or 5 years, or at least did research for a 4 or 5 year period. And during the time she was there, it was the 2016 election. So she was interested, and unsurprisingly, probably for you to know, would be that they were very strongly in favor of Trump. So they were very much voting along those lines, even though from an economic perspective, they suffered by Republican and other policies. So one of the questions she had is, why did they vote that way? And she has this concept, what she calls a deep narrative. And the basic deep narrative is that mostly white working class people in sort of small cities are struggling to follow the rules to achieve the American dream. But then there are these liberal policies that allow people to come in and break the rules and cut in line and get their access to the American dream early. What she argues is that there's this kind of story or narrative deep down that kind of acts as a kind of solution to all the problems that they see around. And when she told that story to people, go, yeah, that's right, that's what's going on. And so I take that example as a sort of starting point to think about how narratives is a certain kind of way of justifying forms of power. If they take on the aspect of being a solution without a problem, then that's where things go awry. And part of what philosophy does, part of what philosophy as a learning process entails, is encountering problems, right? Encountering the nature of a problem that will, if not undermine, at least challenge and problematize the narratives that we have. And one role for philosophy, kind of in a Nietzschean vein, and I think this is where perhaps Deleuze was inspired by Nietzsche as well, is a kind of psychologist, right? Where a philosopher can kind of highlight and draw out the narratives, the stories that we presuppose in our making sense of the world around us, which is not something that science does very well. I think that's, again, where philosophy has a role to play that you won't find being done very well in the sciences. So that's kind of a nutshell version of sort of some of the initial ideas that got me started. And along the way, I bring in existential tradition and a number of other figures into that book.
Then it seems like, to resonate with this line that you brought up with Nietzsche and as psychologist, is question of symptomatology that Deleuze not only focuses on in Nietzschean philosophy, but also returns to even in things like Essays Critical and Clinical, when he is thinking about this role that the philosopher may play as a symptomatologist. And so it would seem then that the solution without a problem, as you term it, would be the symptom of a certain way of life and a certain judgment towards life. That's a Nietzschean way of saying it. But I'm also thinking about how it's interesting, this notion of a solution without a problem, because, as Deleuze says, one of the refrains in his work is when he talks about X deserving Y or X meriting Y. And one of those ways is this question about, we get the solutions we deserve based on the determination of, based on how we determine problems. He has a bunch of other, ways of saying this question of what we deserve, but it does make me think that, and it also goes back maybe to this investigation of false problems, right? That if there is, quote unquote, no problem, then maybe that's because they're false problems. Would that be fair, or is that overstating your claim?
No, I think that would be fair. I mean, and I think, and this touches upon something we talked about earlier about being provoked, almost violently provoked into thinking, and tying into the sort of the symptomatology of Nietzsche, is that our narratives, when they get challenged, our reaction is often sort of a knee-jerk rejection. Or one of the interesting issues is, why do people believe conspiracy theories when all the evidence seems to go contrary to them? And I think that kind of ties into this notion of accepting a solution without a problem, so to speak.
Right.
But if we adopt and kind of extend in a way this sort of the Nietzschean symptomatology, then we can perhaps use philosophy as one of the tools to help us become more aware of the limitations to our own stories, right? And I think that's where Spinoza comes back in again, because I think part of the Spinoza narrative in his ethics is to enhance our power and relations. And most conspiracy theories, obviously, at some point they have to draw the line and reject certain facts as being inclusive or able to be included in their narrative. The strongest narratives are going to be the ones that can include more. And so that, from both an epistemological and political perspective, I think is a powerful way to think about the role of philosophy, of trying to enhance our powers and our relations with the world and others.
Yeah, and I like this bringing in Spinoza here, because it does make me think that the way in which he ruthlessly tries to demystify and demythologize would run counter to the tendency one finds in conspiracy theory, which perhaps is an example of a kind of bad infinite regress, because there's always a way in which the disproving of a conspiracy theory is a deeper conspiracy theory in order to sort of make one complacent, if you will, with the status quo or something like this, right? It's that hyper paranoia or even kind of hysteric demand of something behind the veil that's put forth.
And a lot of it, there's also sort of classic defense mechanisms as well. And there's some studies that I cite in that second volume about how we will have beliefs that run counter to what everyone else says, but if it helps us to maintain a sense of viability, a sense of integrity, we will hold on to blatantly false beliefs. And so part of, I think, the task of philosophy going forward, one of the tasks of philosophy going forward, is to think through these types of issues and problematize a lot of the things that we do in the world and the way we think about things in the world. And that is, I think, one of the tasks that Deleuze has taken on in his own writings.
Yeah, that's the question of sort of these conscious interests and being in conflict with these unconscious investments. That's one of the main themes running throughout Anti-Oedipus, where again, they go to Spinoza, how we kind of are fighting for our servitude.
Yeah.
And so I can see how that very clearly ties into this question. I suppose I want to wrap it back around to your intro, because you do mention, anticipating your complimentary book that we've been talking about, that these interrogations on an epistemological level sort of lead one toward what you call a Humean politics. And I wanted to ask that two-part related question. One, how do you see this towards a critical existentialism as being inspired in a Humean way? You've mentioned how it's inspired in a Spinozist way, right? Yeah. And then two, do you see the title of the work we've been discussing today on your inquiry into Analytic-Continental Metaphysics, do you see the inquiry as being in the tradition of Hume, right? Like the inquiry concerning human understanding?
I think, yes. I think the title and inquiry is certainly intentionally echoing sort of a lot of the titles from that period of time, the 18th century, like Hume in particular. But in terms of the other question about sort of the Humean politics, there's kind of two parts to that. The one part, Hume himself, when he was talking about power, the fundamental principles of government, he points out that when it comes to the relationship between those who govern and those who are governed, the power differential always favors the governed. And the question is, why do they allow themselves to be governed? So it's kind of like Hume's version of the same question: why do we allow for our own oppression or desire our own oppression? And Hume's answer to it is that it's opinion that accounts for it, that it's just basically opinion and beliefs that further the power and support the power of those who govern us. If they were to lose that, or if that were to change, then that power may be lost, which leads to the second part: how might it change? And that's where the critical part comes in. And Hume, at times in the treatise, will talk about, there's a famous example where he talks about the Irishman has hot temper and the Frenchman has no solidity, something like that. And even though you might be talking to a Frenchman that seems to have perfectly common sense and reasonable, you're still going to have that kind of bias, that sort of prejudice. And what he then goes on to talk about is that the critical sort of Humean side is to investigate your beliefs with what your experience is telling you. I mean, that's where it is kind of empirical. That's where it's in line with science. So it's with a kind of scientific investigation. So take our opinions or take our stories, our narratives, investigate them critically and see where they are. I mean, this goes back to Socrates. Socrates was doing something very, very similar. And I mean, I think
it's a know thyself, something like that.
Kind of a know thyself as well. So there is a kind of Humean thread that you'll find. And Hume makes it much more clear in his own writing. And his essay writings, I think, were intended as sort of works in public philosophy that people could read and understand, which unfortunately most of my books are not in that vein. My family members cannot read and really understand my books, but I think that's not the case with Hume. I think Hume's books were intended to be able to be critical reflections on contemporary reality. And I think that is, going forward, something that philosophers ought to try to do more of.
I think about this when I read Difference of Repetition. It's difficult not just in the breadth and depth of the work, but I mean, it's surprising. I mentioned Logic of Sense as a kind of, it's his perhaps his most literary solo work. But if you think about, that's just formally, if you think about in terms of the organization of the work, but if you think about the formulation of the theses that Deleuze has, right, in his writing of Difference of Repetition, it's a highly intricate work that in itself has a literary form to it. It almost verges at times on these poetic ecstasies without necessarily being, again, mystical or something like that. It's just, I was rereading certain passages today in preparation for our discussion, and I was just thinking about how that does also lead to part of the difficulty, is that the syntax and grammar and formulation of these, and the repetition, but formulation is itself intricate and complex and demands, it is an encounter, and it demands a little bit of patience. And I think that that's what I would recommend, because when I was reading your work, I thought that, gosh, I mean, just the breadth of the authors you take up and deal with, and the way you're able to organize not just the ideas in terms of these staging these encounters between thinkers in the analytic tradition, but strategically positioning Deleuze along the way in order to further them and deepen them. I thought not only was that organization very clear and, again, strategically brilliant, but I thought that you were able to discuss these ideas in clear language. Now, the ideas themselves are difficult, but your formulation of them, I don't see necessarily as the impediment. I don't want you to be too hard on yourself. I just wanted to say that the material is difficult, but not the it's not, the fault does not lie in your organizational or formulational skills.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I mean, I have always taken my writing as a way of trying to clarify to myself the issues that are going on in what I'm writing about. And if I'm successful in making it clear to myself, that's what I end up publishing. And hopefully that makes it clear to others who are reading it. But I'm also glad that you mentioned the sort of peaks and valleys that you've described a few times. I did feel as I was writing it that it was coming out as kind of a narrative, had sort of a narrative trajectory that was kind of building as I wrote it. It wasn't really intended. This was, as I wrote this, I wrote it in a month. It took me a month to write.
Wow.
This book. And as I wrote it, I didn't know what section would be next. So it was kind of like a journey of discovery for myself as I wrote this book. And I feel fortunate that it came out well. I wouldn't advise it. The companion volume took a lot longer than a month to write. So it just, this particular book, it worked for me, at least, to state it this way. I wrote the first four problems, the first four issues: problem of the new, problem of relations, problem of emergence, problem of one and many, and then just started exploring those, bringing in Analytic and Deleuze. And then, as you say, bringing Deleuze back in at key points to try to tie things up before moving forward again.
I think it's in the preface of Difference of Repetition where, and I know he's got an American preface too, so I should forget that. But in one of those prefaces, he says that, how can we begin to write except on the edges of what we know? If we wait until we know everything, we'll never start writing. So it kind of makes sense that you're writing on the seat of your pants, even if that was a mixed metaphor. You're on the edge of your seat. You're cart before the horse, something like that. But it does make sense in that sense. And I suppose, I know that we could obviously deepen more of these themes, which I encourage the listener to go in and look at this work themselves. They will not be disappointed. But I did want to give time for you to either address anything that we may have left out that you think is key. I'll leave the floor to you to talk a little bit about what you have planned for future publications or what you're perhaps working on right now.
I gave a talk in Tokyo last October, and what that talk was on was comparing the logic at work in logic of sense and logic of sensation, because there hasn't been much that has compared the two. And it's interesting that they both have logic in the title, and one's on Francis Bacon and the art of painting and so on. So I am currently kind of taking up themes in sort of the philosophy of art as another way of sort of, again, exploring some of the questions we've talked about today in terms of individuation, how problems come to be realized or actualized in solutions. And as Deleuze talks numerous times in his painting seminars, that what a painter has when they are painting is a problem before them. And on the one hand, it's a problem of avoiding cliche, but it's also the problem of catastrophe or chaos. All right. It's an attempt to kind of walk that tightrope, as you mentioned earlier. And I also find it as a way that I've taught philosophy of art for a number of years at my university. And I think that's another way to get more people engaged with philosophy, engaged with thinking critically about things and questioning their presuppositions. So that's one project I'm working on. Another one, I'm editing a book on Deleuze and existentialism, and I'm going to write on Deleuze and Kafka. So I'm going to bring up the issue of assemblages, the K function, as they talk about it in that book. So that's the other thing I'm kind of working on at the moment as well.
It's easy to overlook those two things. One, because I have always wondering about the logic of sense, logic of sensation, two titles that are extremely close, and there had to be some conscious decision on Deleuze's part. So yeah, that connection is fascinating, and I'm glad that you are going to be looking at that. And in fact, we're going to have Dan Smith and Charles Duvall on in about 2 weeks, where we're going to be discussing the seminars on painting. Charles is currently editing them for publication at UMin. So this will be the first, like in English at least, first series of Deleuze's seminars that will be published.
Is this the English version of the French one that was just published?
I think so. I would have to, I'll be sure to ask Charles that. I'm pretty sure that might be he may have mentioned that in our exchange. They upkeep the Purdue seminars up on their website. And so what's nice is that it's given him a chance to go back through those. And I think you're right. He mentioned that it's on the occasion of that publication, that now that in French, they're starting to publish them as books, which is great. I think that led to the Minnesota deal. But what's nice is that, as far as I know, and I'll have to check with Charles, but as far as I know, this gave him a chance to edit and revise the extant translations. Hopefully that means on the website, and that there's no conflict of interest where, even if they're already published online, that it wouldn't conflict with the deal to publish as a book form. So hopefully that means that more of those books could come out and therefore get more updated and revised translations. In any case, so I think that resonance between logic of sense, logic of sensation doesn't seem like there's a coincidence.
No.
And the relation between Deleuze and existentialism, I think, is great. And focusing on the Kafka book is important, because sometimes it's easy, because Cooper, you and I, we've covered a lot of the books already, including Anti-Oedipus, but we haven't yet tackled the Kafka book, even though it's short enough to tackle in maybe 1.5, 2 episodes, something like that. And so sometimes it's easy to overlook that intermediary volume between the 2 volumes of Capitalism and Schizophrenia that the Kafka book represents, minor literature. So I think that is fallow ground to be tilled. So that makes a lot of sense. And the last thing I would say, because, you've written on what is philosophy, this bringing up this question of opinion and linking it to Hume, it is interesting. They not only does it link with this question of a paradoxical image of thought or against the orthodox image of thought, right, against doxa, which is one of the enemies that philosophy fights against. But as they say I think it's in the conclusion where, there is a sense in which opinion provides us a little bit of stability in the face of chaos. Yeah. And that's one of those reasons why we cling to it more stubbornly than we perhaps should.
Yeah, I agree. There is, interestingly, there is a kind of Aristotelianism in Deleuze's work, that you want to avoid excess and deficiency, right? That kind of moderation, which you see, especially in painting, when he's talking about representational painting. He doesn't like pure representational figurative painting. but he also doesn't like Jackson Pollock.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So that's why Francis Bacon is this sort of kind of this mean in a sort of Aristotelian sense there, that there's kind of the non-figurative and the figurative kind of indiscernibly becoming mixed, which taps in with a whole bunch of themes in Deleuze's way of thinking about things.
He says something about how, like, you start with the cliche and then yet you work through it. You got to deform it. It's very similar to the monism of pluralism. Like, look, we're moving through these dualisms. Don't think we're ever going to stop and be satisfied with one of them, which is why throughout A Thousand Plateaus, you see so many of the oppositions that they make. They will say it's not so easy, right? It's not enough to have a little bit of suppleness to rid ourselves of fascisms. There's microfascisms, right? It's not enough to just want to think that smooth space is going to save us, right? And that how so many of these are these limit cases, and we're sort of always in, just like in the Horizon, we're always in the middle and in the mixture. And that's a theme that you work throughout your book. I know we didn't spend too much time on that topic. It could have probably filled a whole episode, but yeah, there is that sense of but as you said, maybe that is the Aristotelian mean, when they were like, don't destratify too quickly. A little bit of urban water is all you need.
There's also the historical fact of the Anti-Oedipus book politically was often used to experiment in extreme. And I think Thousand Plateaus was in some sense attempted to moderate or temper some of that tendency. And I think that's where lines like you say, don't expect a smooth space to save us. It won't. We need a little bit of stratification or opinion, to go back to that other point. So
I guess I'll leave off with this, enough of the Deleuze stuff, but we're on it. It's the last drink would be the extreme, right? We're trying to get to that. We're trying to get to the penultimate, right? Maybe that's the mean is get right up to the abyss. Don't fall in. But no, this is great. And I think that and I didn't say enough, but I guess Deleuze and existentialism is a fascinating topic that I think could be explored. I'm trying to remember, maybe I've only read, I can't remember if Deleuze ever says anything outright about Camus.
Not favorably.
No, not favorably. And I know that he even is kind of like, has there ever been a philosopher who's a great novelist? And he's like, no. So even that's kind of also a dig, not just at Camus, but also at Sartre. But, for him, obviously, he's already thinking about the difference between, as you said, creating affects and percepts on the side of art, and creating concepts on the side of philosophers. So the question of like greatness does a lot there. But in any case, this question of Deleuze and existentialism is interesting, because we know he devoured being in nothingness over like a 3-day weekend, but he kind of hated existentialism as a humanism. There is this interesting, intricate, complex relation that we see with Deleuze, which, we can see that throughout his work. He's got nice things even to say about Kant and Hegel. It's not ever really a straightforward venom or rejection on his part, right? So that's really fascinating, and I'm looking forward to that.
Well, I've found, at least as a teacher, that the existentialism class is always one of the more popular classes I teach. And I think that, and as I said earlier, is my origin story. It was the class that really got me into philosophy. So I do think that part of the reason for that is that it really taps into the relevance questions of meaning and significance and for our lives. And I do think, although Deleuze was dissatisfied with the humanist angle of existentialism, he certainly was still concerned about questions of meaning and sense and the conditions that create them, social, political, etc. And much of the rest of his work, especially with Guattari, was sent exploring that. And the Kafka book, there isn't a lot out on the Kafka book, but it really does capture the whole notion of assemblage and all these other ideas that are very pivotal concepts in A Thousand Plateaus. So, and as you said, it's a short book too. And Kafka's great. How can you not like Kafka?
And I do think that it is a nice continuity with Anti-Oedipus, because of the fact that not just artists, but literary writers are doing a lot of work. For them, they're like, hey, it's not our fault if these writers seem to have more understanding of schizophrenia than the therapists and the psychoanalysts. So you see literature what they call the art machine, the artistic machine, functioning very much to get the other machines going, like the revolutionary machine, the analytic machine. So it makes sense that Kafka would be sort of a continuity between the two volumes, which, one could argue A Thousand Plateaus as a book is more literary, right? In its rhizomatic concatenation. But the literary isn't exempt from Anti-Oedipus. It's just not necessarily mobilizing the form of that work. So, yeah.
They do talk a lot towards the end of Anti-Oedipus about Turner, the Turner painting. So
right. And I know you not to pun. Okay, you turned to Turner in your work as well. I know that Deleuze was fascinated with him. I think he writes a little bit about Turner in the Bacon book. But Guattari himself too talks in his seminars about Turner, and they're interested in, he's interested in these what he calls like these black holes in the painting, right? That kind of like suck us in, or that draw in almost like a gravitational force the perspective of the viewer. Anyway, Jeffrey, I know I'm sure we could talk for hours and hours more.
Well, we can always do it again sometime if you'd like.
Yes, I definitely want to extend an open invitation for you to come back on the show. Hopefully, maybe in the fall, winter.
Okay.
We try to have our favorite guests on at least yearly. So I think that would be great to have you back on. I thought our conversation went extremely well today, and I really enjoyed our back and forth. And I suppose we'll let you get back to the rest of your Sunday. And I just want to thank you for your time and your willingness to come on. And let's extend a thanks to our mutual friend Henry for connecting us.
Yeah, and I want to thank you again both for taking the time out of your Sunday and the time that it took to read the book. And I enjoyed the conversation. I got a lot out of it, and it's encouraging that some of what I did was successful. So that was good.
Yeah,
good to hear as well.
And we don't necessarily have to wait for you to complete the books you're working on now. We could always turn to the companion book as a follow-up. Okay. I'll be in touch about that. So we can potentially set this up a few months from now, maybe towards the end of the semester or something like that.
Okay.
May or June would probably be a good time. But I think it'll probably be, now that we've got a little bit of a backlog, it'll probably be in 3 weeks or so that we might, up to a month, that this episode will come out. And so I will be in touch beforehand and let you know, so you can share with whoever you think might enjoy our talk. But until then, I just want to thank you again, and we'll be in touch and we'll talk soon.
Okay. Thank you. You all have a great day.
Thanks again, Jeffrey.
Jeffrey.
All right. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Once again, thanks to Jeffrey Bell for joining Taylor and I on this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour.
The very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is unconscious, to the whole state of things, pure violence without object. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.